I don't think that there has ever been a dog that I've met in my life that I didn't love. Every single dog I've ever come across has just been a great thing. Dogs are just incredible creatures if you really want to think about it. Thank you, Mother. Now I've got my notes, so I'm not going to get lost. It's that kind of morning, everybody. Anyway, dogs are the absolute best. I don't like cats, partially because I'm very allergic to them to the point that if I'm around them for long enough, I will die, but also just because cats are terrible. Dogs, however, are just amazing creatures. They love you no matter what. Just the minute they know you a little bit and they've got a chance to smell you, they love you. They just care a lot about you. They don't get too loud unless, there's something going on or that your life is being threatened by the devious mailman. He's going to get you one day. But dogs are just incredible. If Mandy would be okay with it, if it would be allowed by my wife, I would easily have 5 or 6 dogs. No problem. Let's do it. Bring them on. But as it stands right now, she let me cap out at 2 dogs. So we have 2 absolutely amazing dogs. First off, we have Maybe, not Baby. Maybe, as in maybe we'll keep this one. Here's a picture of her. So you can kind of see her. Maybe is 14 years old. She's starting to go blind. She's losing some teeth. But she doesn't do a lot anyway, and she's never really done a lot. She's just there. She just lays down, and that's about it. There have been a lot of days where I'll leave to come to work, and I'll come home, and she's in the exact same spot she was whenever I left. And because she's 14, I go over and make sure she's still breathing. But Maybe's a great dog. But we also have Rudy. Here's Rudy right here. Look at that handsome fella. Rudy is my dog. He is the absolute best. I love Rudy. He is a great dog. He is playful. He is sweet. He is affectionate. He could probably learn a thing or two about personal space, if I'm honest with you. He does like to get all up in your business. Just last night Mandy's visiting her parents, so she and I were video chatting so I could check in with her and the girls and see how they're doing. And Rudy heard Mandy's voice, and he got up right in my face while I was on the couch. I think I had about a 1/4 inch gap between the two of us. But Rudy is also a bit of a dork, as this photo might show you a little bit. He is amazing. I love this dog. Let me tell you about him, though. He is the largest dog I've ever had in my life. I've had a dog, with the exception of the year before Mandy and I got married when I was living in an apartment. I've had a dog my entire life, but Rudy is by far the largest dog I've ever owned. He's not the largest dog I could own, but he's 100 pounds, which when you've gone your whole life with dogs between 30 and 40 pounds, and then you get a 100-pound dog, that's a lot. That's a big adjustment to make. And almost every bit of that weight that he has is 100% muscle. That dog he's solid. Well, he didn't start off that way. If you've watched the midweek moments, you may have known back in January I told you that he was getting a little flabby. So I've been walking him pretty consistently, and that dog is now 100% muscle. You go to pet him, and he's a brick. And sometimes he's about as intelligent as a brick, as the picture shows. Anyway, but Rudy is one of the strongest dogs I've ever had. When we first got Rudy did not understand the concept of boundaries. And so whenever we would let him outside, usually with Maybe, we'd just open up the back door, let her go do her thing, and she'd come back in right away, especially if it was raining. She just doesn't like being outside. But Rudy didn't understand the concept of boundaries, and the house that we were living in at the time, we didn't have a fence. None of our neighbors had fences for at least a block. And so it was not uncommon if we opened the door that Rudy would just take off like a shot. And I don't know if you know this, but most of your neighbors don't like it when a strange dog just shows up in the middle of their yard. I mean, for me, that's just awesome, but I had one in particular who just really was not fond of that. So we had to get to the point where we had to walk Rudy around even in the backyard with a leash. Now, when Rudy was little, he was like most other dogs. He felt the need to let me know where we were going, and he would pull on that leash as hard as he possibly could. And again, it's a 100-pound dog of pure muscle. So if he's leading, you're going to follow whether you want to or not. Mandy could not do it. It had to be me, because of course it did. And the dog would just kind of keep pulling to the point that he was choking himself and kind of keep going to that point where he was just going to keep going and pushing me to go wherever I wanted him to go. There was one particular instance where we had a flock of birds just hanging out in our backyard. I don't know why. They were just there. And I was taking Rudy on this particular walk. And as we got close to where the birds were, the birds all took off, and Rudy decided he was going to try to catch one. And that sudden jolt of his motion was enough to throw my back and my shoulder completely out. We realized that by just having him on a leash, we were giving him far too much leeway, and it was only causing him pain, and now it was causing me pain. So we had to try to find some other solution. If we were going to continue to walk the dog, we had to find some other way to kind of get him to walk in the manner that we know he ought to walk, and in a way that's going to be safe for him and mostly for me. So we did a little research, we did a little digging, but all we could really find was the concept of what's called the choker chain. If you're not familiar with what that is, it is literally a chain that wraps around your dog's neck, and if they continue to pull on it, it chokes them, hence the name choker chain. Stay with me, folks, I promise we're getting somewhere with this. They even make them now to where there are little metal spikes that as your dog continues to pull, it will dig into him. Now, here's the thing. I wanted Rudy to walk the way that I wanted him to. I didn't want him to keep pulling on me. I didn't want him to have the kind of freedom and leeway that he'd had just on the leash. But I didn't think this was the best option, because if we went with a choker chain, all we were doing was trading pain for pain. It was too aggressive. It was too overbearing. I thought it was just too much. I didn't want to hurt the dog, not all the time at least. So we had to find a different solution. And finally, after doing some digging and some research, we found this thing, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it, because I had never heard of it up to this point. It's called a gentle lead. What it is a little apparatus that instead of going around the dog's neck, it actually goes around his snout. And you hook your leash onto it and stuff like that. And as Rudy, in this case, would pull, you just give him a slight little tug, and it moves his whole snout, and it corrects his behavior. The first time I ever took Rudy on a walk with this gentle lead, he was a whole different dog. Since we've had this thing has been amazing because it allows me to kind of be able to correct Rudy in a way that is not going to bring about pain, in a way that is going to be gentle. It's not going to give him so much freedom that he's going to hurt himself and me, but it's also not going to be too overbearing and cause him sorts of pain. Correction is always such a hard thing for us to understand. It's a difficult thing to know how far do we need to go in no matter what arena that we are in life. That's true whether we're talking about pets, we're talking about kids, we're talking about employees, and yes, even when we're talking about ourselves. Where do you draw the line? What constitutes the need for correction? When do you step in and bring about that correction? How stern does that correction have to be? These are all questions that we need to face in some way, shape, or form. Things that we need to ask ourselves, and they're not easy questions to answer, especially when we're talking about correcting ourselves or other people. But there's something that we've got to figure out. Too much freedom without parameters can be a dangerous thing. But it can also be a danger in overcorrecting people because you make them feel constant guilt, fear if they may step out of bounds, or just cause more pain in their life than what they need. There has to be some kind of a balance in our correction. And the same thing is true within the church. Believe it or not, as far as I'm aware, there's never been a single person who's ever gotten out of the baptistry and was suddenly the perfect Christian. Well, whatever the perfect Christian is. I don't think there is such a thing as the perfect Christian, but nobody has ever immediately been a fantastic Christian and followed Jesus perfectly after the fact. So whether we want to admit this or not, in our walk with Christ, sometimes there needs to be some correction. Sometimes we need to be corrected. Oftentimes we're holding on to bad habits, things that we did before we came to know Jesus, and we need to get rid of it. Sometimes we don't know that we're messing up. Sometimes we don't know that what we're doing is wrong, and we need somebody to kind of come and point that out to us. And let's be real, sometimes we know exactly what we're doing. And there's a need for people to come and hold us accountable to our actions. People who are going to correct us in the manner in which we need to be corrected. There is a right way and a wrong way to go about these sort of things. But there is always a need for correction. There's always a need for improvement in order for us to continue to grow in our unity. If we're going to continue to grow united, sometimes that means that we're going to need that correction. And that need is one that never really leaves, no matter how long or how closely we have been following Jesus. In fact, in our text today, we see a correction that needed to take place. We're being told about it after the fact, but we're given enough to show this is exactly a correction that needed to take place. But if you're anything like me, as you read this particular text, it can be kind of surprising to read about this type of correction to this person. It's an unexpected correction that needs to take place. Paul tells us about this in Galatians 2. He sets the stage off for who it is that he's about to bring correction to in Galatians 2, verse 11. I don't have the text up on the slides today. Sorry. As you saw beforehand, we're having some issues. So you're going to have to read along. I know it's the worst. Galatians 2, verse 11 says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." Now, there's two quick things about this particular verse that I want to point out right off the bat. I know, we just read one verse. It's barely a line, but we're going to get through it first. First off, the first thing I want to point out, I love Paul. I just do. He gives you the impression as he talks about this that he approached Cephas to his face. So he gives you the picture that he went nose to nose, eye to eye with this guy. Paul has never really seemed to be the kind of guy who worries much about what people think about him. I love it. I wish I was a little more like it, but I like to be liked. So. The second thing that I got to ask here is, who's Cephas? Who's he talking about here? Now, if you're reading another translation, or if you are familiar with this story, you may already know the answer to this question, but if you don't, then the answer is actually going to be kind of surprising to you. When Paul talks about Cephas here, he's talking about Peter. Yeah, that Peter. The guy who walked side by side with Jesus himself. The first person to ever call Jesus the Messiah, the one who had been with Jesus from the very start of his ministry, the one who in his very first sermon led 3,000 people to faith in Jesus Christ. Cephas is not a name that's meant to bring about confusion, because actually Jesus himself referred to Peter as Cephas. In John chapter 1, verse 42, he says, "And he brought Simon to Jesus, and when Jesus saw him, he said, 'You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas,' which is translated Peter." When Paul says Cephas, everybody who was part of that initial church knew exactly who he was talking about. For us, we have that confusion because we only call Peter, Peter. But Paul is telling us about a time when Peter himself needed to be corrected. And Paul was willing to do that very thing. Verse 12 gives us an indication of what it was that Peter was doing. It says, "For he regularly ate with the Gentiles before certain men came from James. However, when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he feared those from the circumcision party." Peter started off being very content to be around the Gentiles. And now, we've talked about this before. Before Acts chapter 10, most Jews would not associate with Gentiles. If you were from the Jewish background, you were raised from the time you were a small child to not associate with Gentiles unless you were conducting business. Because you were the Jews, you were the ones who were chosen by God himself. You were the promised people of God. You were special, you were separate. And to associate yourself with Gentiles was a way to make yourself unclean. But it makes sense that Peter, before this, would actually have no problem being around the Gentiles, because again, in Acts chapter 10, Peter was the one who was given the vision from God himself. The vision of a sheet coming down filled with all kinds of animals that were traditionally considered unclean. And the voice of God telling him to kill and eat. This is, again, the vision that allowed for Gentiles to come and enter the fold of Jesus Christ. It was the first time that God ever indicated to the Christians that the Gentiles are part of this plan. It's also the vision that gave us access to all sorts of unclean animals. And I love bacon, so I love Acts chapter 10. Anybody else? Cool. Anyway. So Peter is sitting around eating with Gentiles, and this makes sense. He's the one who had the vision. He's probably eating a lot of those things that were in that vision and enjoying it. But something happens. Something changes Peter's perspective. Something takes place. And Paul tells us that certain men came from James. Now, I did a lot of digging on this because it kind of bothered me. We know who James is. James was part of the close circle of Jesus' disciples, right? Anytime that he broke off from the 12, he always took with him Peter, John, and James. And so were these men actually sent from James himself? Well, the actual indication of most people is that no. What Paul is indicating by saying they came from James, he's actually saying is they came from Jerusalem. This is after the death of Stephen. This is after all sorts of persecution and the first time that the church actually left Jerusalem. We spent a lot of time talking about the church in Jerusalem. But after Stephen, the church faced all kinds of persecution, and a lot of people left Jerusalem mostly to stay safe. But James was one of the ones who stayed. James was a pillar of the Christian church in this particular moment, and he stayed in Jerusalem. So when anybody came from Jerusalem, it was said they came from James, because that's the level of respect that James held. But I don't believe that these guys came from James himself. See, because when they show up on the scene, Paul talks about the shift that takes place in Peter. That all of a sudden, Peter's not hanging out with the Gentiles. All of a sudden, Peter is not eating that food that the Gentiles are eating. All of a sudden, Peter seems to be rebuilding a wall that he had already broken down. He's creating separation between himself and the Gentiles. He's distancing himself from them. He's kind of reverting back to what he probably was before Acts chapter 10. And Paul points out that he does it because he's afraid. He's afraid of what these guys have to say. And it's likely that this particular group that we're talking about, these people that come in and join the fold and lead Peter astray and lead him to create these divisions where he did not have divisions, that these are the same Pharisee Christians that we've talked about so frequently. Guys who were coming along to all these Gentile churches being established, saying, if you really want to follow after Jesus, you got to follow the law of Moses too. Because Paul refers to them as the circumcision party. What a terrible party to be at. These guys had come in, and somehow they were so convincing and so convicting and so persuasive in their words that they led Peter, one of the pillars of the church, the guy who had been there for all of it, they were able to lead him astray. That would have been bad enough. That would have been terrible enough that Peter himself had allowed himself to be led astray here. But it actually was worse than that, because verse 13, Paul tells us, then the rest of the Jews joined in his hypocrisy. So that even, this name hurts, Barnabas was led astray by this hypocrisy. Peter, again, was one of the pillars of the church. He's the guy. He's the one. First sermon, 3,000 people. There's a very good chance that for all these Jewish Christians that are with Paul, the people who are helping to establish this particular church in Galatia, or not in Galatia, but in Antioch is where they were. These particular guys who were there helping out Paul, that Peter had some part to play in their faith. For all we know, some of them may have been amongst those first 3,000. So when they saw Peter doing these sorts of things, when they saw Peter talking about what these Pharisee Christians were telling him, it kind of makes sense that, they'd follow suit with him. I want to give Peter some credit here, though. Okay? Just stick with me here. If I could play devil's advocate for a moment. Understand, before Acts chapter 10, Peter had lived his entire life under these particular beliefs and mindsets. They were rooted in his most fundamental core memories of his life. From the time he was a small boy until the time Jesus showed up on the scene, he had been told by his parents, by teachers, by people in the community to stay away from Gentiles. And I don't know if you know this to be true in your own life, but I know it's true in mine, that those deep set-in mindsets, those traditions that I have been a part of for my entire life, it's hard to get rid of those. Those habits that I developed, whether good or bad, are difficult to get rid of entirely. And so yes, while Peter was the one who had the vision of the sheet, and while Peter was the first one to bring about a Gentile convert, it probably wasn't that hard for him to go back to this. Because it's just that default setting in his mind. And I don't know that Peter intended to lead these others astray. I know for myself, though, that those things that I've held on to for years are the hardest to let go. But regardless of the fact as to how deep set those traditions and mindsets were for Peter, regardless as to how easy it was for him to fall back into that, it was still wrong. It was still wrong. Because Peter was treating the Gentile Christians as less than. Because he was going about saying, unless you follow the law of Moses, unless you're willing to take that yoke and that burden of the law, a law that was so difficult to follow that absolutely nobody until Jesus was able to do it, then you can't really be a Christian. He created division. Unintentionally, for sure. But he disrupted a unity that was there. He tarnished the unity that they had already shared, a unity that was leading this movement of Jesus Christ spreading to thousands and thousands of people. And he needed to be corrected. And Paul, I love Paul. Paul was more than willing to do that. Because now it wasn't just Peter who was creating the spirit of disunity. Paul felt he needed to do something about it. Verse 14, he tells us exactly what he did. He said, "But when I saw that they were deviating from the truth of the gospel, I told Cephas in front of everyone, if you, who are a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews?" It might be easy to read this particular statement of Paul as Paul being really hostile. And maybe there was a little hostility there. I mean, it's Paul we're talking about. This dude did not mind ruffling feathers. But I don't think that Paul is being intentionally hostile. I don't think that Paul is trying to hurt Peter here. I think had it been just Peter, had Peter been the only one who was doing this, that Paul likely would have come up and pulled him aside one day. They'd have gone to a side room. And Paul probably would have started off, "What's up here, man? Why are you doing this? You know this isn't right. You, above everybody else, know this isn't right." But because Peter had led others astray, because Peter had had that influence on other people, he felt the need to do it in front of everyone. This was so intense that Barnabas, Paul's mentor, was being led astray by it. This was a serious thing, a cancer that was spreading within this church. And Paul felt the need to cut it out right away. So he confronts Peter with this particular thing. He addresses this correction. He goes head on in bringing about the correction of Peter, knowing that the others are going to follow suit. But I have a feeling this wasn't an easy thing for Paul to do. He may have been a little more comfortable with it than you and I might have been, because he's Paul. But it couldn't have been easy for him to pull up in front of Peter, a man who he respected, a man who he admired, a man in some ways maybe Paul was trying to emulate. It could not have been easy for him to bring about correction, because correction is never an easy thing to bring. When we see somebody who's in the wrong, when we see somebody doing something that we know they should not be doing, it's a difficult thing for us to bring about that correction, to bring it to their attention, to ask them about that. It's never an easy thing to do. Most people don't like to give correction to somebody else because we like to be liked. And we're worried that this might somehow disrupt that. Or we're worried that maybe, everybody's having a good time, everybody's happy and smiling, so maybe if we brought about this correction, it might ruin it for everybody else. And we don't want to be the joy kill. We don't want to be the party pooper. But also it's hard to be on the receiving end of correction. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling. I don't know about you, but oftentimes whenever people have had to correct me in some way, shape, or form, my default setting is, no, I don't think so, buddy. Why? Because I'm the hero of my story. Hero can't be wrong. Correction is hard to give. Correction is hard to receive. And yet, correction is something that we desperately need if we genuinely want to draw closer to the heart of Jesus Christ. Correction is a necessity because none of us get it right. Not a single one of us. I will throw my hand up first and say, yep, I don't get it right. In fact, I probably get it wrong a lot more times than I get it right. I'm going to assume that you had the humility to probably say the same for yourself, right? So how are you going to get better? Well, if I just work hard enough on it myself, I'll get better. How often has that worked for you? Now, see, sometimes we need people to come around us. People who love us, who care about us, who actually genuinely want to see us draw closer to the heart of God. When we bring about correction in others, when we allow ourselves to receive correction ourselves, it draws us closer to the heart of Jesus Christ. It helps to make us more in the way that Jesus would have us be. It helps us to better follow after our Lord and Savior. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of the whole point. If we want to become more like Jesus, sometimes that means we're going to need to be corrected. If we want to see those around us that we care about, that we love, that we call our brother and sister in Christ, become more like Jesus, it means that we have to be willing to offer them correction. To step in. Sometimes the only way to produce better fruit in a tree is to cut a couple branches off that are getting in the way. If we want to see the fruit in our friends and our brothers and our sisters grow, it means that we got to be willing to offer that correction. But, please hear me. We have to be careful in how we bring about that correction. We have to be careful in the ways that we choose to approach those that we care about, that we want to bring that correction, that we want to see draw closer to the heart of Jesus. If we choose to not correct them at all and allow their issues to continue to persist, the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to wind up hurting themselves, and like Peter, are probably going to hurt others and lead them astray and cause them to get away from where Jesus wants them to be. But if we're overbearing, Christians never do that, right? We're never overbearing. But if we're overbearing in the way that we correct them, we run the risk of causing them unnecessary pain, of giving them a great deal of stigma, and maybe even causing them to leave the faith altogether. There are two things when we talk about correction that will always lead to disunity within the church. One is too much freedom. To allow sin to continue to run rampant in the lives of those that we know ought to know better. And secondly, to become so overbearing and browbeating and correct so often and so publicly and so violently that nobody can live up to that standard. We have to find another way. We have to find a gentle way. A way that won't discourage, but rather a way that will encourage them. Because correction, when it is done properly, when it is done gently, when it is done out of love, correction will only only lead to further unity. Peter needed to be corrected here. He was wrong. And we could have looked at this and said, well, Peter's Peter. He's the guy. He's the one. Maybe we all need to follow suit. And that's where a lot of the Jews felt. But Paul knew Peter was wrong. And so he was willing to step up into that particular notion. And yet, after Paul corrected him, Peter took the steps that he needed to. It only served to enhance their shared unity. We've talked a few times recently about an event listed in the book of Acts called the Jerusalem Council. It's in Acts chapter 15. If you don't remember, this issue of these Pharisee Christians was becoming so widespread that they felt the need that even though Jerusalem was still hostile territory, to get everybody to gather together there and talk about this particular notion. And we know, or at least hopefully we remember from Acts chapter 15, that the one who spoke first, the one who was willing to say, no, this is not the way we're going to go, was Peter. I consulted every possible biblical expert I could, guys who know more about the Bible than you and I will ever even think to know. And every single one of them has said that the event that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 2 happened before Acts chapter 15. Peter listened to the correction of Paul. He saw the error of his ways. He knew the way that he was wrong. And now he was going to make sure that the church would not fall into the same trap that he did. He was going to do everything he could to prevent others from falling away in the same way that he did. And it brought about a spirit of unity within the church, one that just filled everyone with this love of Jesus and this love for each other. And we know that Peter did not resent Paul for this. Because he said in Acts 15, verse 25, he said, we've unanimously decided to select men and send them to you along with our dearly loved Barnabas and Paul. Peter himself loudly and publicly proclaiming that he loves Paul, the man who brought about correction to him, the man who got in his face and said, you're wrong, bro. When we would think that maybe Peter would have some resentment towards that, that's not what happened at all. Paul cared enough about Peter. Paul loved Peter enough that when he saw Peter doing something that he should not do, when he saw Peter doing this thing that was also leading others into doing things that they should not do, when they were creating disunity within the church itself, Paul cared about Peter enough to bring about correction. To tell him, even though it was hard, even though it was not easy, to tell him simply, you're wrong. Let's get you back on the right path. So often in our faith, we're going to veer off the path. We're human beings. We make mistakes. We're not infallible. We need correction. But we need that correction done out of care and compassion and love. And it needs to be in a gentle way. Peter did not resent Paul for correcting him. Instead, it strengthened their shared bond of respect, of love, and unity together. Correction is hard. It just is. It's never easy. It's never easy to be the one to give it. It's never easy to be the one to receive it. But if we're going to become more than what we are right now, if we're going to become closer to the heart of Jesus, if we're going to become stronger in our faith, if we're going to become more the Christian that Jesus wants us to be, sometimes it's going to mean we're going to need to be corrected. We're going to need someone who cares enough about us to step in and tell us where we're wrong. We're going to need to care about somebody else enough to step in and say, hey man, I think we're going down the wrong way here. Correction is not easy. While it has become easier to lead Rudy with the gentle lead, he doesn't love the thing. but it helps keep him on the path that he's supposed to be on. Correction will help us keep on the path together. And when we love each other enough to the point that we're willing to correct, that correction will only serve to enhance our unity. It will only serve to bring us closer together. Jesus himself gave us a guideline for how to correct. It's right there. It's easy for us to find. I think it'd be wise for us to close with it today. In Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17, Jesus says, "If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault," with this caveat, "between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. If he won't listen, take it to one or two others with you, so that by their testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be established. If he does not pay attention to them, tell the church. If he won't pay attention even to the church, I hope it never comes to this, let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you." Start gently. I firmly believe that 9 times out of 10, that one-on-one correction that starts off first when it's just you telling somebody that you love them, and that because of that love you see this problem, 9 times out of 10, I think it probably stops there. Don't expand it unless you absolutely have to. And I hope it never comes to that last part.
bensound.com